In 476, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political authority in the Latin West. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus by the Germanic commander Odoacer did not feel to those living through it like the dramatic end of a civilization. There was no formal abolition of Roman institutions, no declaration that Rome was finished. Instead, imperial power simply stopped functioning in the western provinces. The imperial court vanished, the army fragmented, and the tax system collapsed. What ended was not Roman civilization itself, but centralized Roman rule. The eastern half of the empire, ruled from Constantinople, continued uninterrupted. Roman emperors still reigned, Roman law was enforced, and Roman identity remained intact in the east. In the west, however, political authority fractured into a patchwork of kingdoms ruled by Germanic elites: Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in North Africa, Burgundians and Franks in Gaul. These rulers did not see themselves as destroyers of Rome. On the contrary, most governed in its name. Roman administration did not vanish overnight. Local aristocracies remained in place. Latin continued as the language of law and governance. Roman tax practices, though weakened, survived in some regions. Even barbarian kings adopted Roman titles and imagery to legitimize their authority. Odoacer ruled Italy not as an emperor, but as king, nominally under the authority of the Roman emperor in the east. Later, Theodoric the Great governed Italy while preserving Roman senatorial institutions and employing Roman administrators. The most durable Roman inheritance was law. Roman legal concepts, property rights, contracts, and administrative procedures continued to shape governance long after imperial collapse. In Gaul and Italy, Roman law was recorded, taught, and applied, even when rulers were no longer Roman citizens by birth. The idea that authority should be legal, structured, and universal did not disappear. It simply lost its central enforcement mechanism. Christianity proved even more resilient. By the late 4th century, it had become the official religion of the empire. When imperial institutions collapsed in the West, the church remained. Bishops became community leaders. Monasteries preserved literacy. Church councils continued to operate. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, emerged as a uniquely powerful figure not because of armies, but because he represented continuity with the apostolic past and the imperial Christian order. As secular authority weakened, the church increasingly filled the vacuum. Bishops negotiated with invaders, organized food relief, and mediated disputes. Roman cities declined in population and infrastructure, but episcopal sees often remained active. Christianity did not merely survive Rome's fall. It became the primary vehicle through which Roman identity was transmitted to the post-imperial world. Equally important was memory. Rome did not die in the imagination of Europe. Roman history, Roman literature, and Roman political ideals continued to circulate. The concept of imperium, the idea of universal authority over a civilized world, retained immense prestige. Even when no emperor ruled in the West, people still believed that such an office should exist. Rome was no longer a functioning state, but it remained an idea. In the 5th and 6th centuries, Germanic rulers increasingly sought legitimacy through Roman recognition. Kings minted coins with imperial symbols. They preserved Roman law codes for Roman subjects, while ruling Germanic followers under customary law. The Roman past became a tool of governance. To rule successfully, one needed to appear Roman. Among the successor kingdoms, the Franks proved uniquely positioned to inherit Rome's legacy. Unlike other Germanic groups, they did not migrate en masse into former Roman territory and settle as a separate ruling caste. Instead, they gradually merged with the Gallo-Roman population of northern Gaul. Their leaders adopted Roman customs, language, and administrative methods more fully than most. The turning point came with the conversion of Clovis, king of the Franks, to Catholic Christianity around 496. While many Germanic rulers had adopted Arian Christianity, which was considered heretical by the Roman Church, Clovis embraced Catholicism. This aligned the Frankish monarchy with the majority of the Roman population and with the papacy. It created a powerful alliance between Frankish military strength and Roman Christian legitimacy. Clovis and his successors expanded Frankish territory through conquest, absorbing Roman lands and institutions. By the 7th century, the Frankish kingdom had become the most powerful political entity in Western Europe, yet royal authority was unstable. Merovingian kings gradually lost real power to aristocratic families who controlled land, armies, and offices. Out of this environment emerged the Carolingians. Originally mayors of the palace officials who managed royal estates and military affairs, they became the true power behind the throne. By the early 8th century, the Merovingian kings were little more than ceremonial figures. The Carolingians ruled in practice, but not yet in name. The Carolingian rise coincided with a crisis facing the papacy. Rome was no longer protected by imperial armies from Constantinople. Lombard forces threatened papal territory in Italy. The Pope lacked military power and could no longer rely on the Eastern Roman Emperor for defense. In this moment of vulnerability, the papacy turned north. The alliance between the Frankish rulers and the Roman Church reshaped European history. In 751, Pepin the Short, a Carolingian leader, deposed the last Merovingian king and took the throne himself. Crucially, this was done with papal approval. The Pope anointed Pepin as king, declaring his rule legitimate in the eyes of God. This act was revolutionary. For the first time, a king's authority was formally sanctioned by the Church. In return, Pepin launched military campaigns against the Lombards and donated conquered territory to the papacy. This created the Papal States and bound the fate of the Roman Church to the Frankish monarchy. The idea of Rome was central to this alliance. The papacy claimed to be the spiritual heir of the Roman Empire. The Franks claimed to be its political protectors. Together they constructed a narrative of continuity. Rome had not fallen, it had been transformed. Imperial authority, once pagan and later Christian, would be reborn in a new form. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, inherited both the Frankish kingdom and this ideological framework. His reign marked a dramatic expansion of Frankish power. Through conquest and diplomacy, he brought most of Western and Central Europe under his control: modern France, Germany, northern Italy, and beyond. Charlemagne ruled as a warrior king, but also as a reformer. He standardized administration, encouraged learning, and promoted Christian education. Latin literacy revived under his patronage. Law codes were written down. Royal officials traveled the realm enforcing justice. Charlemagne deliberately modeled his court on Roman ideals, adopting the language and symbolism of empire. Rome remained the reference point. Charlemagne did not call himself a Roman emperor at first, but his authority increasingly resembled imperial power. He ruled over multiple peoples, enforced Christian orthodoxy, and claimed responsibility for the moral order of his realm. The language of universal rule returned. Meanwhile, the papacy sought stability. Rome itself was politically fragile, racked by factional violence. The Pope needed protection, and Charlemagne was the only ruler capable of providing it. Their mutual dependence deepened. By the end of the 8th century, conditions were set for a profound transformation. There was no Western Roman emperor, yet Roman law, Roman Christianity, and Roman imperial memory were alive. A powerful Christian king ruled much of the former Western Empire. The papacy possessed spiritual authority but lacked military power. Both needed a unifying symbol. Europe still believed in Rome because Rome represented order in a world of fragmentation. It symbolized unity across peoples, law above force, and a Christian mission sanctioned by history. Rome was not merely a city or a government. It was the idea that civilization required a center. In the year 800, that belief would be formalized. But the moment was not an abrupt creation. It was the result of centuries of survival, adaptation, and memory. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, but Rome itself had endured, reborn in law, faith, and imagination. On Christmas Day in the year 800, in the city of Rome, a moment occurred that reshaped the political imagination of Western Europe. During a solemn Mass at St. II Christ, Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon the head of Charlemagne, king of the Franks and Lombards, and proclaimed him emperor. With that act, the imperial title returned to the Latin West for the first time since the 5th century. The event did not simply elevate one ruler, it revived the idea that Rome could exist again as a center of universal Christian authority. The coronation was both symbolic and political. Rome was no longer the capital of a functioning empire, but it remained the most powerful symbol of legitimacy in Western Christendom. By crowning Charlemagne in Rome, the papacy asserted that imperial authority came not only from conquest or heredity, but from divine sanction mediated through the Church. The emperor was presented as the protector of Christianity and the guarantor of order in a fractured world. Charlemagne did not arrive in Rome intending to create a new empire overnight. He had already ruled vast territories and exercised power on a scale unmatched by any Western ruler in centuries. Yet, the imperial title transformed his authority. It placed him within a Roman tradition that claimed universality. He was no longer merely king of a people, but ruler of a Christian world bound together by faith, law, and obedience. The meaning of empire in Charlemagne's time differed fundamentally from that of ancient Rome. The Roman emperors of antiquity had ruled through bureaucratic centralization, professional armies, and an elaborate taxation system. Charlemagne ruled through personal authority, loyalty networks, and religious obligation. His empire was Christian in its foundation and moral purpose. The emperor was expected to defend the faith, enforce justice, and uphold orthodoxy. Imperial authority in this new form rested on cooperation between crown and church. The emperor protected the church with military force. The church legitimized the emperor through ritual, theology, and education. This relationship was not one of equality. Each side believed it served God's will, but their roles overlapped in ways that would later generate conflict. For now, the partnership appeared mutually beneficial. Charlemagne's governance relied on adaptation rather than imitation of Rome. He did not attempt to restore the old imperial bureaucracy. Instead, he worked within the realities of early medieval society. His empire was divided into counties and marches, each administered by counts and military governors. These officials were appointed by the king and sworn to personal loyalty. To limit abuse of power, Charlemagne sent royal agents, known as missi dominici, to inspect local administration, hear complaints, and enforce royal orders. Law was central to Charlemagne's vision of rule. Rather than imposing a single legal code, he allowed different peoples, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, to retain their traditional laws. At the same time, he issued royal decrees, called capitularies, which applied across the empire. These addressed matters such as military service, church discipline, judicial procedures, and public morality. Law became an instrument of moral reform as much as governance. Justice under Charlemagne was intended to reflect Christian principles. Judges were expected to act fairly. Bribery was condemned, and oaths were sworn on religious relics. Punishments were harsh by modern standards, but the emphasis on order and accountability distinguished Charlemagne's rule from the arbitrary violence common in earlier centuries. Education became a cornerstone of imperial reform. Charlemagne understood that effective governance required literacy, especially among clergy and officials. He promoted learning not as a luxury but as a necessity for Christian rule. Under his patronage, scholars from across Europe gathered at his court. Monastic and cathedral schools were encouraged. Texts were copied, corrected, and preserved. This revival of learning, often called the Carolingian Renaissance, was modest in scale but profound in impact. Latin literacy improved, biblical texts were standardized, Roman authors were preserved. A clear, legible script Carolingian minuscule was developed, making texts easier to read and copy. The intellectual foundations of medieval Europe were laid during this period. Religion permeated every aspect of Charlemagne's empire. Conversion and conquest went hand in hand. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Saxon Wars. Over decades, Charlemagne fought brutal campaigns to subdue and Christianize the Saxons of northern Germany. Resistance was met with mass deportations, executions, and forced baptisms. These actions revealed the darker side of imperial ambition, where unity was enforced through violence. Despite its scale, Charlemagne's empire had clear limits. It lacked a permanent capital. Aachen functioned as a favored residence, but governance depended on constant travel. The emperor moved from palace to palace, holding assemblies, dispensing justice, and reinforcing loyalty. This itinerant rule limited administrative continuity. Economically, the empire remained largely agrarian. Trade existed, but long-distance commerce was limited compared to Roman times. There was no unified monetary system capable of supporting large-scale bureaucracy. Taxation was minimal. Royal income came primarily from land, tribute, and plunder. This constrained the reach of central authority. Militarily, Charlemagne relied on the obligation of free men to provide service. Armies were assembled seasonally and disbanded afterward. While effective for expansion, this system lacked permanence. Defense depended on local lords and border regions known as marches. The empire's security was uneven and vulnerable to external pressure. Culturally, the empire was diverse. It encompassed multiple languages, traditions, and legal customs. Latin served as the language of administration and the church, but most subjects spoke regional vernaculars. Unity was ideological rather than cultural. Christianity and loyalty to the ruler were the binding forces. The imperial title itself posed challenges. The Eastern Roman Empire still existed, ruled from Constantinople. There, Roman emperors viewed themselves as the sole legitimate heirs of Rome. Charlemagne's coronation created a rival claim. Diplomatic tensions followed, though eventual recognition came through negotiation. The idea of a single Roman emperor ruling all Christians was no longer realistic. As Charlemagne aged, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Frankish tradition favored dividing inheritance among sons. This practice conflicted with the idea of indivisible empire. Charlemagne initially followed tradition, planning to partition his realm. Death, however, intervened. By 813, only one legitimate son, Louis, remained alive. In an attempt to ensure continuity, Charlemagne crowned Louis as co-emperor in 813. This act emphasized dynastic legitimacy and sought to preserve unity, yet the underlying problem remained unresolved. The empire depended heavily on the personal authority of its ruler. Without Charlemagne's presence, its cohesion was uncertain. Charlemagne died in 814 and was buried in Aachen. His death marked the end of an extraordinary reign, but not the end of the imperial idea. The structures he created endured, though weakened. His successors inherited an empire that was vast, prestigious, and fragile. The imperial revival under Charlemagne was not a restoration of ancient Rome, it was a transformation. Rome was reborn as a Christian ideal rather than a bureaucratic state. The emperor became a moral ruler, defender of faith, and symbol of unity rather than an absolute administrator. This new model would shape European political thought for centuries. Yet the contradictions were already visible. Empire without bureaucracy, unity without uniformity, authority without permanence. These tensions defined Charlemagne's achievement. His reign proved that Rome could live again in memory and meaning, but also that sustaining such an empire required more than conquest and coronation. The challenge of preserving imperial unity would dominate the centuries to come. When Charlemagne died in 814, the empire he left behind appeared immense and powerful, yet its strength rested on fragile foundations. Authority had been concentrated in a single ruler whose personal presence, military reputation, and religious prestige held together a vast and diverse realm. With his death, that unifying force vanished. What followed was not immediate collapse, but a gradual process of fragmentation that reshaped the political landscape of Europe. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, inherited the imperial title and the burden of preserving unity. His reign exposed the weaknesses of the Carolingian system. Imperial rule depended on loyalty rather than institutions, and loyalty proved difficult to sustain across generations. Louis attempted to balance Frankish tradition, which favored dividing lands among heirs, with the imperial ideal of indivisible authority. These goals were fundamentally incompatible. Conflict within the ruling family became the defining feature of the empire's decline. Louis's sons fought each other repeatedly, drawing nobles into their rivalries and weakening central authority. Civil wars disrupted administration, drained resources, and undermined respect for imperial power. Royal assemblies continued, laws were still issued, and the language of empire remained, but enforcement grew inconsistent. After Louis's death in 840, open warfare between his sons led to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The empire was divided into three realms. West Francia formed the core of what would later become France. East Francia encompassed lands that would eventually develop into Germany. Middle Francia, stretching from the North Sea through Italy, proved unstable and quickly fragmented further. The imperial title survived, but its territorial base was shattered. This division marked a turning point. The Carolingian Empire ceased to function as a single political unit. Kings ruled their respective territories with increasing independence. The imperial idea remained, but it lacked a coherent center. Authority shifted downward, away from emperors and kings toward local lords, bishops, and regional magnates. As central power declined, external threats intensified. The 9th and 10th centuries were marked by waves of invasion that further destabilized Europe. From the north came the Viking seafaring warriors who raided, traded, and settled across vast distances. From the east came the Magyars, mounted archers whose rapid raids devastated Central Europe. From the south came Saracen forces, operating from bases in the Mediterranean and raiding coastal regions. Viking incursions exposed the weakness of Carolingian defenses. Rivers became highways for attack. Cities, monasteries, and royal estates were plundered. Paris was besieged multiple times. Kings lacked standing armies capable of rapid response. Defense increasingly fell to local leaders who fortified towns and organized militias. In return for protection, they demanded land, privileges, and autonomy. The Magyars posed an even greater threat to the eastern regions. Their raids penetrated deep into the former imperial heartlands, reaching Italy and western Francia. Carolingian rulers struggled to counter them. Royal armies were slow, coordination poor, and leadership fragmented. Entire regions were devastated, populations displaced, and trade disrupted. Saracen raids affected southern Italy and the Mediterranean coast. Although less extensive inland, these attacks further strained already weakened political structures. The combined pressure of invasions accelerated the decentralization of power. Local defense became more important than imperial authority. Yet despite these pressures, the empire did not vanish. The imperial title continued to exist, even as its practical power diminished. Kings still sought legitimacy through Carolingian ancestry or imperial recognition. Roman law, Christian ideology, and administrative habits persisted. The framework of empire survived, even when its substance seemed hollow. In East Francia, a new political identity began to emerge. Unlike West Francia, where royal authority steadily weakened, the Eastern Kingdom gradually consolidated under a series of strong leaders. These rulers drew support from powerful regional dukes, particularly in Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia. The balance between king and nobility remained tense, but cooperation proved more sustainable than constant division. The collapse of Carolingian authority did not erase the memory of empire. Instead, it created space for transformation. The imperial idea shifted from a Frankish inheritance to a German one. East Francia retained closer ties to Italy and the papacy, both central to imperial legitimacy. Geography and political necessity pushed Eastern rulers toward a renewed claim to empire. The defeat of the Magyars became a crucial factor in this transformation. For decades, no ruler could effectively stop them. Local defenses slowed raids, but could not eliminate the threat. This changed under a new generation of leaders who reformed military organization and strengthened royal authority. Among them, the Saxon dynasty proved decisive. Its leaders emphasized cooperation with the church, control over duchies, and defense of the realm. Kingship in East Francia became increasingly associated with protection, order, and Christian leadership. The memory of Charlemagne's empire served as both inspiration and warning. The church played a stabilizing role throughout this period. Bishops and abbots acted as administrators, diplomats, and local rulers. They preserved literacy, law, and institutional continuity. Monasteries rebuilt after raids. Ecclesiastical networks connected regions even when secular authority fractured. The church remained one of the few truly trans-regional institutions in Europe. Roman concepts of authority continued to shape political thought. Even fragmented rulers issued laws in Latin, minted coins with imperial symbols, and sought papal approval. The idea that legitimate power derived from a universal Christian order did not disappear. It adapted to new circumstances. By the early 10th century, East Francia had begun to recover. Fortifications multiplied, military organization improved, cooperation between king and nobles strengthened defense. In 955, a decisive victory over the Magyars ended the era of devastating eastern raids. This success dramatically enhanced royal prestige and reinforced the association between kingship and divine favor. With external threats reduced, attention returned to the question of imperial authority. Italy remained politically fragmented, but it was still essential to the imperial tradition. Control of Italy meant access to Rome, the papacy, and the legacy of the ancient empire. Eastern kings increasingly intervened in Italian affairs, presenting themselves as restorers of order. The imperial title had not vanished because it fulfilled a powerful ideological need. In a world of competing kingdoms, it represented unity above division. It linked rulership to divine purpose. It provided a framework within which law, faith, and authority could coexist. Even when emperors were weak, the office itself retained immense symbolic value. This persistence explains why the empire survived decades of fragmentation. It existed not only as a political structure, but as a shared belief. Kings, bishops, and nobles continued to act as if imperial authority mattered, even when it was limited in practice. That belief prevented complete dissolution. By 962, conditions had changed. A strong ruler from East Francia had secured his kingdom, defeated external enemies, and asserted influence in Italy. The imperial idea, long weakened but never abandoned, was ready to be claimed again. The empire had survived not because it remained powerful, but because it remained meaningful. Fragmentation did not destroy the empire, it transformed it. The Carolingian world gave way to a new political reality in which empire would no longer mean centralized rule over a uniform territory. Instead, it would become a framework of authority, law, and legitimacy that could adapt to changing circumstances. The survival of that idea ensured that Rome, though divided and diminished, was not finished. The political landscape of East Francia in the early 10th century was shaped by insecurity, fragmentation, and the lingering memory of Carolingian rule. Kingship existed, but its authority was fragile, dependent on cooperation with powerful regional dukes and bishops. It was within this unstable environment that Otto I emerged as a ruler capable of transforming kingship into something far more enduring. Otto inherited the throne in 936. His succession was not automatic. Regional dukes in Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia possessed strong military resources and deep local loyalties. Any king who attempted to rule without their support faced rebellion. Otto understood this reality and chose a strategy that combined force, negotiation, and institutional innovation. His goal was not merely to survive as king, but to impose a lasting order on a fractured realm. From the beginning of his reign, Otto faced revolts. Members of his own family challenged his authority. Dukes resisted royal oversight. Instead of dismantling the duchies, Otto sought to control them. He defeated rebels militarily, then reappointed loyal relatives or allies to key positions. Through this approach, royal authority was reasserted without destroying the existing political framework. The decisive factor in Otto's consolidation of power was his relationship with the church. Otto recognized that bishops and abbots differed from secular nobles. They could not pass their offices to heirs, and their authority depended on royal appointment and protection. By placing loyal churchmen in positions of power, Otto created a network of administrators whose interests aligned with the crown. This system transformed governance. Bishops served as royal advisors, judges, and military supporters. Monasteries became centers of administration, as well as spirituality. In exchange for land and privileges, the church provided stability, literacy, and institutional continuity. Kingship gained a moral dimension rooted in Christian duty rather than purely dynastic claims. While Otto strengthened internal control, external threats still loomed. The most serious were the Magyars, nomadic warriors whose raids had terrorized Central Europe for decades. Their mounted archers moved quickly, striking deep into settled lands before defenses could be organized. No ruler had yet achieved a decisive victory against them. Otto recognized that defeating the Magyars was essential not only for security, but for legitimacy. A king who could protect his people would command loyalty unmatched by rivals. Otto reorganized military forces, coordinated regional levies, and imposed discipline on troops drawn from different duchies. In 955, Otto confronted the Magyars near the Lech River. The battle that followed was not merely a military engagement, it was a turning point. Otto's forces held their ground, countered Magyar tactics, and achieved a decisive victory. The invaders were crushed, their leaders captured and executed. Magyar raids into Western Europe ceased permanently. The victory transformed Otto's position. He was no longer simply a successful king, he was seen as the divinely favored defender of Christendom. Chroniclers portrayed the triumph as a sign of God's approval. Royal authority gained a sacred aura, reinforcing the connection between kingship and divine order. With the eastern frontier secured, Otto turned south. Italy, long fragmented by internal conflict, remained essential to imperial legitimacy. Control of Italy meant access to Rome and the papacy, the symbolic heart of Christian authority in the West. Italian politics were unstable, and the papacy itself was embroiled in factional struggles. Otto intervened as a stabilizing force. His armies entered Italy, and he asserted authority over local rulers. The Pope at the time, John XII, faced threats from rival nobles and sought Otto's protection. The alliance mirrored earlier partnerships between Frankish rulers and the papacy, but the balance of power had shifted. Otto was not merely a protector, he was a king whose authority extended across regions. In 962, Otto was crowned emperor in Rome. The coronation carried immense symbolic weight. It linked Otto directly to the Roman imperial tradition and to Charlemagne's legacy. Yet this was not a simple revival of Carolingian Empire. It was a redefinition. The imperial title now rested firmly on German kingship. Otto did not claim authority over all former Carolingian lands. Instead, he ruled a core realm in East Francia, extended influence into Italy, and accepted the imperial role as a moral and legal authority rather than an administrative one. Empire became a framework of legitimacy, not a centralized state. The coronation affirmed continuity with Rome while acknowledging historical change. The emperor was no longer a ruler seated in Rome, commanding a universal bureaucracy. He was a Christian monarch whose authority derived from God, recognized by the Church, and exercised through personal leadership and alliances. Rome was the source of legitimacy, not the center of administration. Otto's relationship with the papacy reflected this shift. The emperor assumed a role in papal politics, asserting the right to intervene when order was threatened. The Church, in turn, relied on imperial protection. This mutual dependence created a powerful but unstable alliance. For the moment, cooperation outweighed conflict. The church-state alliance under Otto reshaped imperial governance. Bishops and abbots functioned as imperial officials. Ecclesiastical courts enforced law. Royal assemblies included clerical leaders who advised on policy and doctrine. The empire was conceived as a Christian order in which spiritual and secular authority worked together to maintain justice and peace. This model proved effective in the short term. It provided administrative capacity without a permanent bureaucracy. It bound regional elites to the crown through shared religious purpose. It allowed the emperor to rule across diverse territories without imposing uniform institutions. Yet the alliance also planted seeds of future conflict. By granting extensive powers to churchmen, Otto strengthened institutions that would later assert independence. For now, however, the arrangement stabilized the realm and elevated imperial authority beyond anything achieved since Charlemagne. Why then does 962 mark the true beginning of the Holy Roman Empire? The answer lies not simply in the act of coronation, but in what Otto's reign achieved. Unlike earlier imperial revivals, Otto's empire rested on durable foundations. Kingship in East Francia had been consolidated. External threats had been neutralized. The church had been integrated into governance. The imperial title was no longer an experiment, but the culmination of a coherent political system. Charlemagne's empire depended heavily on personal dominance and rapid expansion. When that dominance faded, unity collapsed. Otto's empire was smaller, but more resilient. It accepted decentralization as a reality and transformed it into a structured hierarchy of loyalties. Empire became less about direct control and more about recognized authority. The empire founded in 962 was not universal in the Roman sense, nor centralized in the Carolingian sense. It was a Christian polity defined by law, ritual, and tradition. Its strength lay in legitimacy rather than force. Its continuity lay in institutions rather than conquest. Otto ruled until his death in 973. By then, the imperial framework he established was firmly in place. The title passed to his successors. The alliance with the church endured. The idea of empire was no longer a fading memory or a revived dream. It had become a permanent feature of European political life. Rome, once again, had an emperor in the West, not as a ruler of ancient provinces, but as the symbolic head of a Christian order. The Holy Roman Empire did not begin with Charlemagne's coronation, nor with the fall of Rome centuries earlier. It began when kingship, faith, and imperial tradition were fused into a lasting system. That fusion occurred in 962 under Otto the Great. By the 11th century, the political order established under Otto I had matured into a complex balance between imperial authority and ecclesiastical power. Emperors ruled not through centralized administration, but through networks of loyalty, law, and religious legitimacy. Central to this system was control over the church. Bishops and abbots were not only spiritual leaders, they were landholders, judges, and administrators. Whoever controlled their appointment controlled a major portion of imperial governance. For generations, emperors had exercised the right to appoint bishops and abbots within their realm. This practice, known as lay investiture, involved the ruler granting church officials their symbols of office. It ensured that church leaders remained loyal to the crown and integrated into imperial administration. The arrangement had stabilized the empire after centuries of fragmentation. Yet it also blurred the boundary between spiritual and secular authority. At the same time, the church was undergoing its own transformation. Reform movements gained momentum, particularly those associated with monasteries that sought to free the church from secular influence. Reformers condemned simony, the buying of church offices, and clerical marriage. They argued that the church must be spiritually pure to fulfill its divine mission. Increasingly, they viewed imperial involvement in church appointments as corruption rather than cooperation. This tension was not merely institutional, it was ideological. Emperors believed their authority came from God and that ruling the Christian world required oversight of the church. Popes and reformers asserted that spiritual authority was superior to temporal power and that only the church could appoint its leaders. These competing claims could not coexist indefinitely. The conflict reached its peak during the reign of Henry IV. Henry inherited the throne as a child, leaving the empire governed by regents and nobles who expanded their own power. When Henry came of age, he faced rebellions from princes who resisted royal authority. Control over church appointments became one of the few reliable tools available to assert imperial power. At the same time, the papacy entered a new phase of assertiveness under Pope Gregory VII. Gregory was a committed reformer who believed that the Pope, as successor of St. Peter, held supreme authority over the Christian world. He rejected the idea that secular rulers could appoint bishops. For Gregory, lay investiture was an affront to divine order. In 1075, Gregory issued decrees forbidding lay investiture and asserting papal authority to depose emperors. This was an unprecedented claim. Never before had a pope openly declared the right to remove a reigning emperor. The statement challenged the foundation of imperial legitimacy. Henry responded by asserting his traditional rights. In 1076, he convened a council of bishops who declared Gregory deposed. Henry addressed the Pope not as supreme pontiff, but as a rebellious monk. This confrontation escalated the dispute from institutional disagreement to open war between empire and papacy. Gregory answered with a weapon more powerful than armies: excommunication. He declared Henry excommunicated and released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. In a society where political authority was bound to religious legitimacy, this act was devastating. An excommunicated ruler was cut off from the church and, by extension, from divine favor. The impact was immediate. German princes, already hostile to Henry's authority, used the excommunication as justification to rebel. They demanded that Henry reconcile with the Pope or face deposition. Imperial power, already fragile, stood on the brink of collapse. In the winter of 1077, Henry made a dramatic decision. He crossed the Alps and traveled to northern Italy, where Gregory had taken refuge at the fortress of Canossa. There, Henry waited in the snow for days, dressed as a penitent, seeking absolution. When Gregory lifted the excommunication, Henry's immediate political survival was secured. The walk to Canossa became one of the most powerful symbols in European history. It represented the humiliation of imperial authority before the papacy. Yet the meaning of the event was complex. Henry was not surrendering his crown, but using religious ritual to regain legitimacy. Gregory, in granting absolution, reaffirmed the Pope's moral supremacy while preserving the appearance of mercy. The reconciliation did not end the conflict. Once restored to communion, Henry resumed efforts to assert control over the empire. Civil war erupted in Germany between factions loyal to the emperor and those supporting papal-backed rivals. Gregory excommunicated Henry again. Henry responded by installing an anti-pope and marching on Rome. The struggle became violent and prolonged. Armies clashed, cities changed hands, and alliances shifted. The papacy itself was forced to flee Rome, relying on Norman allies for protection. The ideal of a unified Christian order collapsed into open warfare between its supposed leaders. The investiture conflict extended far beyond the personal rivalry of Henry and Gregory. It exposed structural weaknesses in imperial authority. By claiming the right to depose emperors, the papacy empowered rebellious nobles. Princes learned that loyalty to the emperor was conditional and that papal support could legitimize resistance. For the Church, the conflict achieved partial success. Lay investiture was challenged, and papal authority expanded in theory, yet the cost was high. The papacy became entangled in political violence, undermining its moral authority. Rome itself suffered instability and foreign intervention. The conflict dragged on after the deaths of both Henry and Gregory. Successive emperors and popes continued to contest the boundaries of authority. The struggle was finally resolved in 1122 with a compromise that separated spiritual and secular aspects of appointment. Bishops would be chosen by the Church, but emperors retained a role in granting temporal authority. By then, the damage to imperial power was irreversible. The German princes emerged stronger, having exploited the conflict to secure greater autonomy. Imperial authority became increasingly dependent on negotiation rather than command. The emperor remained a symbol of unity, but his ability to enforce decisions diminished. The investiture conflict transformed the Holy Roman Empire. It marked the end of the Ottonian model of close church-state cooperation. The Church gained institutional independence, while the empire lost a key mechanism of governance. The balance of power shifted permanently toward regional rulers. The ideological consequences were equally profound. The conflict established the principle that spiritual and temporal authority were distinct, even when both claimed divine origin. This distinction reshaped European political thought and laid foundations for later struggles between church and state. For the empire, the 11th century represented a turning point. The imperial crown survived, but its authority was weakened. What had once been a system of integrated rule became a negotiated order among competing powers. The investiture conflict did not destroy the empire, but it ensured that it would never again be a centralized authority. From this moment forward, the Holy Roman Empire would exist as a complex balance of emperor, princes, and church, bound together by tradition, law, and ritual, yet divided by competing claims to power. The struggle between empire and papacy left a lasting scar, shaping the political character of medieval Europe for centuries to come. By the 12th century, the political structure of the Holy Roman Empire had entered a new phase. The empire still claimed universal authority, Roman continuity, and Christian legitimacy, yet its internal reality had changed fundamentally. The imperial crown endured, but its ability to command obedience diminished. Power increasingly shifted away from the emperor toward territorial princes, ecclesiastical lords, and autonomous cities. What emerged was not chaos, but a distinctive form of decentralized rule. The weakening of central authority did not happen suddenly. It was the cumulative result of earlier conflicts, especially the investiture conflict, which had undermined the emperor's control over the church and empowered regional elites. Princes learned that imperial authority could be challenged, negotiated, and limited. The crown, once the focal point of governance, became one power among many. Territorial princes were the primary beneficiaries of this transformation. Dukes, counts, margraves, and bishops consolidated control over defined regions. These territories were no longer loosely held offices granted by the emperor, but increasingly hereditary domains. Lords built castles, raised armies, administered justice, and collected revenues with minimal imperial interference. This process varied across the empire. In some regions, large principalities emerged, capable of rivaling royal authority. In others, smaller lordships proliferated, creating a dense patchwork of jurisdictions. What united them was a growing sense that political power was rooted in land, lineage, and local institutions rather than imperial appointment. The emperor's authority depended on cooperation rather than command. Imperial assemblies continued to meet, laws were still proclaimed, and the language of empire remained intact. Yet enforcement relied on the willingness of princes to comply. When imperial interests aligned with regional ones, cooperation followed. When they did not, resistance was common. The church remained deeply embedded in this system. Bishops and abbots controlled extensive lands and exercised secular authority within them. Ecclesiastical principalities functioned much like secular ones, complete with courts, taxes, and military obligations. Although the church had gained independence in spiritual matters, its temporal power tied it firmly into the feudal order. Alongside princes, a new political force gained prominence: the free imperial cities. These urban centers developed from former Roman towns, episcopal seats, or commercial hubs. Through charters, privileges, and gradual assertion of rights, some cities freed themselves from the control of local lords and placed themselves directly under imperial authority. Imperial cities did not answer to regional princes, but to the emperor alone. In practice, this often meant significant autonomy. City councils governed local affairs, courts enforced urban law, and militias defended city walls. Economic strength gave these cities leverage. Trade, crafts, and markets generated wealth that rural lords could not easily control. Urban autonomy reshaped imperial society. Cities became centers of commerce, legal innovation, and political participation. Merchant guilds and civic institutions fostered collective identity. Urban law emphasized contracts, property rights, and written records, contrasting with the customary practices of feudal lordship. The rise of cities further weakened centralized rule. Emperors often relied on urban support to counterbalance powerful princes. In exchange, cities received privileges that reduced imperial oversight. The crown gained allies but lost direct control. Authority became fragmented among multiple power centers with competing interests. Legal traditions reflected this decentralization. The empire never developed a single, uniform legal system. Instead, multiple layers of law coexisted. Feudal law governed relations between lords and vassals. Canon law regulated church affairs. Roman law, preserved and revived in universities, influenced administration and courts. Local customary law continued to shape everyday justice. Imperial courts existed, but their reach was limited. Disputes were often resolved locally through lordly courts, city tribunals, or ecclesiastical judges. Appeals to imperial authority were possible, but slow and uncertain. Law became less a tool of central governance and more a framework for negotiation among powers. Feudal relationships themselves evolved. Originally based on personal bonds of loyalty, they became increasingly territorial and hereditary. Vassalage tied individuals to land and lineage rather than to the person of the emperor. Obligations were defined by custom and contract, not imperial command. The emperor's military power declined accordingly. Without a standing army, imperial campaigns depended on the willingness of princes to provide troops. Military service was often limited, conditional, or substituted with payments. This reduced the crown's ability to enforce decisions through force. Economic change reinforced decentralization. The agrarian economy remained dominant, but trade expanded along rivers and routes connecting cities. Wealth flowed increasingly through urban markets rather than royal estates. Princes and cities controlled tolls, mints, and markets, strengthening their independence. Despite these shifts, the empire did not collapse. Its survival rested on adaptation. The imperial crown retained symbolic authority as the guarantor of peace, justice, and order. Imperial titles conferred prestige. Legal traditions continued to reference imperial sovereignty. Even powerful princes sought recognition within the imperial framework. The emperor's role changed. Instead of direct ruler, he became arbiter and mediator. Imperial authority was exercised through diplomacy, legal judgments, and ceremonial leadership. The empire functioned as a legal and political order rather than a centralized state. This decentralized structure had advantages. It allowed diverse regions to develop according to local conditions. It reduced the likelihood of absolute tyranny. It fostered legal pluralism and economic vitality. Yet it also limited collective action and made the empire vulnerable to internal rivalry and external pressure. By the end of the 12th century, the transformation was complete. The empire had become a complex mosaic of principalities, cities, and ecclesiastical territories, bound together by tradition and law rather than direct control. The crown remained essential, but no longer supreme. The weakening of centralized rule was not a sign of failure, but of evolution. The Holy Roman Empire adapted to the realities of medieval Europe. End of quote. Its strength lay not in uniformity, but in its ability to accommodate diversity within a shared framework. This decentralization would shape the empire's future. It enabled remarkable endurance, allowing the empire to survive centuries of change. At the same time, it ensured that imperial authority would always be contested, negotiated, and limited. Power in the empire no longer flowed from a single center. It was distributed across princes, cities, and institutions, creating a political order unlike any other in Europe. The 15th century marked a turning point for the Holy Roman Empire. After generations of civil conflict, weak central authority, and negotiated compromise, the empire entered a phase of deliberate reform. This was not an attempt to return to centralized imperial rule in the Roman or Carolingian sense. Instead, it was an effort to stabilize a decentralized system through law, institutions, and shared governance. Reform emerged not from imperial dominance, but from collective necessity. By the early 1400s, the empire faced mounting pressures. Feuding among princes disrupted trade and security. Justice was uneven, often violent, and highly localized. Imperial authority existed largely in theory, while in practice power rested with territorial rulers and cities. Yet despite these weaknesses, the empire endured, and many within it sought ways to make it function more effectively. Reform was driven by a recognition that survival required adaptation. The emperor alone could not impose order, but the empire as a whole could create mechanisms to reduce chaos. This shift in thinking marked the transition from a medieval empire defined by personal rule to an early modern polity defined increasingly by institutions. One of the most important reform efforts focused on peace. Private warfare among nobles, known as feuding, had long been accepted as a legitimate means of resolving disputes. By the 15th century, its destructive impact was undeniable. Merchants, cities, and lesser nobles demanded stability. The concept of a general peace enforced by law rather than arms gained traction. Imperial assemblies became the primary arena for reform. Representatives of princes, bishops, and cities negotiated measures designed to strengthen order without threatening autonomy. Reform proposals emphasized cooperation, shared responsibility, and legal process. The empire was redefining authority as something collective rather than absolute. A central achievement of this reform movement was the creation of permanent imperial institutions. Previously, imperial justice depended heavily on the Imperator Euro's presence and personal judgment. This was impractical in a vast and fragmented empire. Reformers sought to create courts that could operate continuously and independently. The establishment of the Times Imperial Chamber Court Times marked a major step forward. Designed to serve as a supreme judicial body, it allowed subjects to appeal disputes beyond local jurisdictions. The court aimed to reduce feuding by providing legal alternatives to violence. Its judges were drawn from across the empire, representing different estates and legal traditions. The creation of this court did not eliminate local justice, but it added a new layer of authority. Law became a shared imperial resource rather than the exclusive tool of territorial rulers. Even powerful princes could be challenged through legal means. This strengthened the empire as a legal order, if not as a centralized state. Alongside judicial reform came administrative change. The growth of bureaucracy was gradual but significant. Written records, standardized procedures, and professional officials became more common. Imperial governance increasingly relied on documents rather than personal command. This shift reflected broader European trends toward administrative rationalization. The emperor remained an essential figure, but his role evolved. He acted less as a direct ruler and more as coordinator, mediator, and symbol of unity. Governance depended on negotiation with imperial estates rather than unilateral decree. Authority flowed through assemblies, courts, and offices. This transformation reached its height under Time's Maximilian I, whose reign bridged the medieval and early modern worlds. Maximilian embraced reform not to centralize power, but to modernize imperial structures. He supported judicial institutions, administrative reforms, and efforts to limit internal conflict. Maximilian understood the limits of imperial power. He lacked the resources to impose absolute rule, but he recognized the potential of institutions to enhance stability. His reign demonstrated how the empire could function through cooperation between emperor and estates. Reform was a shared project rather than an imperial command. Legal reform was closely tied to intellectual change. The revival of Roman law, studied in universities, influenced imperial courts and administration. Legal professionals trained in written law brought consistency and predictability to governance. This did not erase customary law, but it reshaped how justice was conceived and applied. Cultural and intellectual transformation accompanied political reform. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on classical learning, humanism, and historical consciousness, reached the empire through universities, courts, and cities. Scholars studied ancient texts, languages, and history, fostering new ways of thinking about authority and society. Humanist scholars did not reject tradition outright. Instead, they sought to reconcile classical ideals with Christian values and existing institutions. The Empira Euro's Roman heritage gained renewed significance. Imperial authority was increasingly justified through history, law, and scholarship rather than divine symbolism alone. Printing accelerated these changes. Books circulated ideas rapidly, connecting intellectual centers across the empire. Legal texts, religious works, and political treatises reached broader audiences. Literacy expanded among clergy, officials, and urban elites. Knowledge became a tool of governance as well as culture. Cities played a central role in this transformation. Urban centers were hubs of commerce, education, and administration. City councils adopted written statutes, maintained archives, and employed trained officials. Urban governance demonstrated how institutional rule could function without personal lordship. At the same time, tradition remained powerful. Feudal rights, noble privileges, and ecclesiastical authority were not abolished. Reform sought balance, not revolution. The empire adapted by layering new institutions onto old structures rather than replacing them. This balance defined the early modern empire. It was neither fully medieval nor fully modern. Knights still fought feuds, but courts offered alternatives. Princes guarded autonomy, but accepted imperial law. Emperors ruled symbolically, but institutions governed practically. Imperial reform was uneven and incomplete. Enforcement remained difficult. Powerful territories could ignore rulings. Resources were limited. Yet the overall trajectory was clear. The empire was becoming a rule-based order. The 15th century did not resolve all contradictions. Religious unity remained fragile. Political authority was still contested. But the foundations of early modern governance were laid. The empire proved capable of reform without collapsing or centralizing. By embracing law, bureaucracy, and cultural renewal, the Holy Roman Empire adapted to a changing world. Tradition provided legitimacy, modernization provided functionality. The result was a unique political structure, a Euro ancient in name, evolving in practice. This balance allowed the empire to endure into the age of religious upheaval and global change. Reform did not make the empire powerful in a conventional sense, but it made it resilient. The Holy Roman Empire entered the modern era not as a centralized state, but as a complex legal civilization, a euro, one that could survive by changing how it ruled rather than who ruled. The 13th century opened with uncertainty at the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The ambitions of Frederick Barbarossa and his successors had reaffirmed imperial prestige, but they had not resolved the structural weakness of the crown. Authority depended on consensus among princes whose power had grown steadily for generations. When strong leadership faltered, the empire slipped easily into conflict. The death of Emperor Henry VI in 1197 exposed the fragility of imperial succession. His heir was a child, and rival factions among the princes seized the opportunity to advance competing claims. Two candidates were elected by different groups of electors, plunging the empire into civil war. This was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a recurring pattern that would dominate the late medieval empire. Disputed successions became common. The imperial crown was elective, not hereditary, and election required agreement among powerful princes with conflicting interests. Each succession crisis weakened central authority as candidates offered concessions to secure votes. Privileges granted during these struggles were rarely revoked, further strengthening regional powers at the expense of the crown. Civil wars did not always involve large-scale battles, but they destabilized governance. Competing kings issued rival laws, appointed rival officials, and sought recognition from the papacy. The empire fragmented politically even as it remained nominally united. Loyalty became conditional, shifting with circumstance and advantage. The papacy played an influential role in these disputes. Popes claimed the right to judge imperial elections and to approve or reject candidates. This intervention intensified rivalries and prolonged conflicts. Imperial authority appeared increasingly dependent on external validation, undermining its autonomy. By the mid-13th century, the empire entered a prolonged period of weakness known as the Great Interregnum. For years, no universally recognized emperor ruled. Princes governed independently, cities expanded their autonomy, and imperial institutions stagnated. The absence of strong central leadership accelerated decentralization. When emperors did rule, their power was limited. They lacked permanent revenues, standing armies, and administrative structures. Governance relied on personal presence, negotiation, and legal symbolism. The emperor's authority was strongest where he held hereditary lands and weakest elsewhere. At the same time, the princes who elected emperors consolidated their role as kingmakers. These leading territorial rulers, later known as electors, recognized their collective power. By controlling access to the crown, they could shape imperial policy and protect their autonomy. The imbalance between weak emperors and powerful electors defined the late medieval empire. Emperors increasingly ruled by compromise rather than command. Imperial assemblies became forums for negotiation rather than instruments of enforcement. The crown survived by accommodating regional interests. Out of this environment emerged one of the most significant constitutional developments in imperial history, the Golden Bull of 1356. Issued under Emperor Charles IV, the Golden Bull did not attempt to restore centralized authority. Instead, it formalized political reality. The Golden Bull defined with unprecedented clarity who had the right to elect the emperor and how that election would occur. 7 electors were designated, 3 ecclesiastical archbishops and 4 secular princes. Their territories, privileges, and voting rights were confirmed. Majority vote would determine the outcome, reducing ambiguity and limiting prolonged disputes. This formalization brought stability to succession, but at a cost. By codifying the electors' privileges, the Golden Bull entrenched their independence. The emperor could not interfere in their territories, summon them arbitrarily, or revoke their rights. The crown's authority was constrained by law. The Golden Bull also reinforced the territorial nature of power. Electors ruled their lands with near-sovereign authority. They minted coins, levied taxes, and exercised justice. The emperor's role became that of first among equals within a legally defined hierarchy. Yet the Golden Bull was not a declaration of imperial weakness alone. It was also an act of survival. By accepting decentralization, the empire preserved unity through law rather than force. Clear rules reduced the likelihood of civil war. Predictability replaced chaos. The formalization of the electoral system marked a transformation in how the empire functioned. It was no longer aspiring to centralized monarchy. Instead, it became a constitutional order grounded in legal norms, shared procedures, and mutual recognition among its members. Imperial authority shifted from command to arbitration. The emperor presided over assemblies, confirmed privileges, and served as the ultimate legal reference point. Imperial courts and legal traditions gained importance, even as direct control waned. Law became the glue holding the empire together. Cities and lesser princes benefited from this arrangement. Legal frameworks protected their rights against arbitrary interference. Appeals to imperial law provided recourse when conflicts arose. The empire functioned as a legal umbrella rather than an administrative state. This transformation did not eliminate conflict. Feuds, regional wars, and political rivalries continued, but they occurred within a shared understanding of imperial order. Even when authority was contested, the language of empire remained central. By the early 15th century, the empire had stabilized in its decentralized form. Emperors ruled for longer periods. Elections were more orderly. The papacy's role in imperial succession diminished. The empire endured not because it dominated, but because it adapted. The late Middle Ages reshaped the Holy Roman Empire into something unique. It was not a nation-state, nor a centralized empire, but a legal and political framework encompassing diverse territories. Its strength lay in its flexibility and longevity rather than in coercive power. From 1200 to 1437, chaos forced compromise. Civil wars revealed the limits of authority. Weak emperors accepted reality. Powerful electors shaped the constitution. The Golden Bull crystallized a system that traded centralization for stability. The empire survived by redefining itself. Rome's legacy endured not through armies or bureaucracy, but through law, ritual, and shared belief. The Holy Roman Empire entered the modern age not as a unified state, but as a complex legal order, one capable of surviving where others collapsed. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire appeared politically stable, yet spiritually tense. Imperial institutions had been strengthened, legal mechanisms refined, and cooperation between emperor and estates normalized. Beneath this surface order, however, deep religious dissatisfaction existed. Criticism of clerical corruption, demands for reform, and disputes over authority had circulated for decades. When these tensions erupted, they would fracture the empire more profoundly than any civil war. The rupture began in 1517, when Times Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and university professor, challenged the Church's practice of selling indulgences. His objections were initially theological and academic, rooted in concerns about salvation, repentance, and scriptural authority. Yet the implications of his arguments extended far beyond doctrine. By questioning papal authority and the Church's monopoly over religious truth, Luther undermined one of the central pillars of imperial unity. Luther's ideas spread rapidly. Printing presses carried his writings across the empire. Pamphlets, sermons, and translations of the Bible reached clergy, nobles, and urban populations. What might once have remained a local dispute became a mass movement. Religious debate moved from universities into streets, courts, and city councils. The empire's structure shaped the course of the Reformation. Political decentralization allowed local rulers and cities to choose how to respond. Some condemned Luther and enforced Catholic orthodoxy. Others protected him, reformed church practices, and embraced his teachings. Religious allegiance became increasingly tied to territorial authority. The emperor, Charles V, inherited an empire already accustomed to negotiated governance. As a Catholic ruler committed to religious unity, Charles viewed the Reformation as a threat not only to faith, but to imperial order. Unity of belief had long been seen as essential to social stability and political legitimacy. Imperial attempts to suppress Protestantism faced immediate obstacles. Charles ruled a vast composite monarchy with responsibilities far beyond the empire, including conflicts in Italy, wars with France, and defense against Ottoman expansion. His attention and resources were divided. Moreover, imperial authority depended on cooperation from princes, many of whom found the Reformation politically advantageous. Some rulers embraced Protestantism out of conviction. Others did so to assert independence from both Rome and the emperor. By seizing church lands and controlling religious institutions, territorial princes expanded their power. Religious reform and political autonomy reinforced each other. Imperial diets became battlegrounds of faith. Assemblies debated doctrine, authority, and obedience. Edicts were issued condemning heresy, but enforcement varied widely. The empire's legal framework, designed to manage diversity, struggled to contain religious division. Religious fragmentation deepened throughout the 1520s and 1530s. Cities reformed worship, abolished monasteries, and reorganized church governance. Clerical marriage became common in Protestant territories. Catholic regions responded with their own reforms, reinforcing discipline and orthodoxy. The empire no longer shared a single religious culture. Attempts at compromise repeatedly failed. Colloquies between theologians sought agreement on doctrine, but differences over authority and sacraments proved irreconcilable. Theological disagreement hardened into confessional identity. Religion became a marker of political loyalty. Armed conflict followed. Protestant princes formed defensive alliances, arguing that resistance was justified to protect true faith and lawful rights. Charles eventually turned to force, launching campaigns against Protestant territories. Military victories proved temporary. Each settlement was undermined by renewed resistance or shifting alliances. The emperor's vision of restored unity faded. The empire lacked the means to impose religious conformity. Coercion risked permanent civil war. Negotiation became unavoidable. This reality culminated in 1555 with the Times Peace of Augsburg. The agreement did not restore unity. It formalized division. It recognized the coexistence of Catholicism and Lutheranism within the empire. Each territorial ruler gained the right to determine the religion of their lands. Subjects, unwilling to conform, could emigrate. The principle established, often summarized as "the ruler's religion determines the territory's religion," marked a decisive break with medieval assumptions. Religious unity was no longer considered achievable or necessary for imperial survival. Instead, order would be maintained through legal recognition of difference. The Peace of Augsburg stabilized the empire politically, but at a profound cost. It entrenched religious division as a permanent feature of imperial life. Territories became confessional states. Borders increasingly reflected faith as well as power. The empire ceased to function as a unified Christian body. The settlement also had limitations. It recognized only Catholicism and Lutheranism, excluding other Protestant movements. This omission would later fuel further conflict. Moreover, ecclesiastical territories faced unique challenges, as conversion by their rulers threatened to destabilize existing structures. Despite its flaws, the Peace of Augsburg represented an imperial adaptation. It preserved the empire by redefining unity. Authority shifted from enforcing uniform belief to managing coexistence. Law replaced doctrine as the basis of order. The long-term consequences were profound. Religious identity became intertwined with political allegiance. Imperial institutions had to navigate confessional division. Trust between estates weakened. Compromise became more complex and fragile. The Reformation permanently altered the empire's character. What had once been a shared Christian order became a pluralistic legal framework. The emperor remained a symbol of unity, but no longer a guardian of religious harmony. By the end of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was irreversibly divided. Catholic and Protestant territories coexisted uneasily, bound by law, but separated by belief. The Reformation had not destroyed the empire, but it had transformed it. Unity was no longer spiritual, it was procedural. This transformation ensured survival, but also set the stage for future catastrophe. Religious coexistence without reconciliation created tension beneath the surface of legal order. The empire endured, but the rupture ran deep, awaiting the moment when compromise would fail and conflict would return on an unprecedented scale. By the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire existed in a state of tense equilibrium. Religious division had been legalized but not resolved. Catholic and Protestant territories coexisted under a fragile legal framework that depended on trust, restraint, and constant negotiation. Beneath this surface order lay resentment, fear, and competing visions of authority. When conflict finally erupted, it would consume the empire and transform Europe. The war began in 1618 as a localized crisis within the empire. In the Kingdom of Bohemia, Protestant nobles feared that their religious rights were under threat from a Catholic monarchy determined to restore uniformity. Their rebellion was not initially aimed at destroying the empire, but at defending privileges guaranteed by earlier settlements. Yet the empire's structure ensured that no conflict remained local for long. The rebellion escalated when Bohemian leaders rejected their Catholic king and elected a Protestant rival. This act directly challenged imperial authority. The emperor viewed it as rebellion against lawful rule and divine order. What followed was an imperial intervention intended to restore obedience. Instead, it ignited a chain reaction. Religious war quickly became something larger. Protestant and Catholic princes across the empire interpreted events through the lens of confessional survival. Alliances formed along religious lines, but political calculation mattered as much as faith. The conflict spread from Bohemia into the German lands, drawing in neighboring powers. What began as an internal imperial struggle soon became a continental war. Denmark intervened to support Protestant forces seeking influence in northern Germany. Later, Sweden entered the conflict with greater force, combining religious motivation with strategic ambition. Catholic powers responded in kind, determined to preserve their position. Foreign intervention fundamentally altered the character of the war. The empire became a battlefield for rival European powers whose goals extended far beyond religious doctrine. Armies marched across imperial territory, often indifferent to the welfare of the population they traversed. The war was no longer about restoring order within the empire, it was about reshaping the balance of power in Europe. The nature of warfare intensified destruction. Armies were large, mobile, and expensive to maintain. Soldiers lived off the land, requisitioning food, seizing livestock, and extorting towns. When supplies failed, plunder followed. Civilians bore the brunt of violence, starvation, and disease. Entire regions were devastated. Villages disappeared. Fields lay fallow. Trade routes collapsed. Famine and plague followed in the wake of armies. In some areas, population declined catastrophically, taking generations to recover. The war did not simply kill, it dismantled social and economic life. Imperial authority collapsed under the strain. The emperor lacked the resources to control allied forces, let alone foreign armies operating on imperial soil. Princes pursued their own interests, switching allegiances when advantageous. Imperial institutions continued to exist, but their decisions carried little weight in the face of military reality. The idea of the empire as a unified political order disintegrated. Loyalty shifted from emperor to territory, from universal authority to local survival. Law gave way to force. Negotiation was replaced by coercion. The empire's legal framework, designed to manage diversity, proved incapable of containing total war. Religion, once the spark, became increasingly secondary. Catholic and Protestant forces fought alongside unlikely allies. Political survival and strategic advantage outweighed doctrinal purity. The war exposed the limits of confessional unity as a basis for political order. The involvement of France marked a decisive turning point. Though Catholic, France intervened against the emperor to weaken imperial power and prevent domination of Central Europe by a single dynasty. The conflict's original religious logic gave way entirely to geopolitical competition. As the war dragged on, exhaustion set in. None of the major powers could secure decisive victory. The cost in lives and resources was staggering. Pressure mounted for a negotiated settlement, yet reaching agreement proved extraordinarily difficult. Too many actors, interests, and grievances were involved. Negotiations began while fighting continued. Diplomats gathered for years, attempting to construct a peace that could be enforced. The challenge was not simply to end hostilities, but to redefine the political order of the empire and Europe itself. The result was the Times Peace of Westphalia, concluded in 1648. It was not a single treaty, but a complex series of agreements that ended the war and reshaped international relations. The Peace of Westphalia confirmed religious pluralism within the empire,